The scars on Meredith Foster's back were a map of every mistake she had ever made, etched in raised white lines that crisscrossed her skin like the railroad tracks spreading west across the territories. She kept them hidden beneath high-collared dresses and shawls, even in the sweltering heat of Georgetown, Colorado, in the summer of 1878, and she had never once let another living soul see them since the night they were made. She had come to Georgetown 3 years prior, a woman alone with a carpetbag and enough money sewn into her skirts to buy the old millinery shop on Rose Street. The town sat high in the Rocky Mountains, a silver mining boomtown where fortunes were made and lost daily, where the sound of stamp mills never ceased their thunderous rhythm, and where a woman with secrets could disappear into the chaos of progress. Meredith sold hats to miners' wives and dance hall girls alike, her skilled fingers shaping felt and ribbon into confections that made even the hardest women feel beautiful for a moment. She was kind but distant, helpful but never familiar, and in 3 years she had not accepted a single invitation to dinner, to church socials, or to the summer dances held in the streets when the mining companies declared a holiday. The women of Georgetown called her peculiar. The men called her untouchable. Meredith called herself safe. Xavier Abbott rode into Georgetown on a Thursday afternoon in late June with dust on his boots and a string of 6 horses trailing behind his roan gelding. He was a horse trader, 26 years old, with sun-darkened skin and hands that moved over the animals with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his broad shoulders, and the gun belt slung low on his hips. He had inherited his father's ranch outside of Denver, but Xavier preferred the freedom of the road, buying horses from ranches struggling in the economic downturn, and selling them to mining operations that needed steady animals for hauling ore carts through the mountain passes. He had been to Georgetown twice before, but this time something made him look up as he passed Rose Street. Through the window of the millinery shop, he caught a glimpse of a woman with auburn hair pinned in a simple knot, her face turned toward the light as she worked. There was something in the way she held herself, a careful stillness, that made him slow his horse without quite knowing why. Meredith felt the weight of his gaze even through the glass. She had developed an instinct for being watched, a prickling at the back of her neck that had saved her more than once. When she looked up, she saw him immediately, a cowboy on a dusty horse, staring at her shop with an expression she could not read. For a moment, their eyes met, and Meredith felt something she had not felt in years, a flicker of curiosity beneath the ever-present fear. Then she dropped the curtain and turned back to her work, her heart hammering against her ribs. Xavier continued to the livery stable, but the image of the woman in the window stayed with him. That evening, after he had sold 4 of his horses to the terrible mine and secured lodging at the Hotel de Paris, he found himself walking back toward Rose Street. The millinery shop was closed, its windows dark, but he stood outside for a long moment before shaking his head at his own foolishness and walking away. Next morning, Meredith opened her shop to find a customer already waiting. Xavier Abbott stood on her doorstep with his hat in his hands and an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. "Morning, madam," he said. "I hope I am not too early." Meredith's first instinct was to turn him away, but something in his manner stopped her. He did not have the swagger of the miners who sometimes tried to court her, nor the calculating coldness of the men who reminded her too much of her past. He simply stood there, waiting, his hazel eyes direct but not invasive. "We open at 9, she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You are 10 minutes early. I apologize." He made no move to leave. "I am looking for a gift for my sister. She is getting married next month, and I thought perhaps a fine hat might please her." It was a transparent excuse. Georgetown was hardly the place to shop for a Denver wedding, but Meredith found herself opening the door anyway. "Come in, then." The shop smelled of lavender and sizing, and every surface held examples of Meredith's work. Xavier looked around with genuine appreciation, though he was far more interested in watching the way she moved through her domain, her fingers trailing over ribbons and lace with practiced familiarity. "What colors does your sister favor?" Meredith asked, all business. Xavier had to think quickly. His sister Catherine had been married for 3 years already. "Blue," he said, remembering her favorite dress. "Light blue, like a summer sky." Meredith pulled out several options, and for the next 20 minutes they discussed trimmings and styles. Xavier knew nothing about hats, but he found himself enjoying the conversation anyway. When Meredith spoke about her work, a little of the guardedness left her expression, and he caught glimpses of the woman beneath the armor. "This one," he said finally, pointing to an elegant creation of pale blue silk with cream-colored roses. "She will love it." The price was steep, but Xavier paid without hesitation. As Meredith wrapped the hat in tissue paper, he cleared his throat. "I wonder, Mrs. Foster," Meredith lied automatically. The fictitious wedding ring had been sold long ago, but she kept the title as another layer of protection. Xavier felt a sinking disappointment but pressed on. "Mrs. Foster, I wonder if you might recommend a good place for supper." "I am new to town, and the hotel where you are staying has an excellent dining room," Meredith interrupted, handing him the wrapped hat box. "Good day, Mr. Abbott. Xavier Abbott." He took the box, then pulled a card from his vest pocket and laid it on the counter. "If you or your husband ever have need of good horses, I would be honored to help." Meredith did not correct his assumption. She simply nodded and waited for him to leave. But after the door closed behind him, she found herself picking up his card and studying the simple lettering. Xavier Abbott, horse trader, Denver, Colorado territory. She should have thrown it away. Instead, she slipped it into her pocket. Over the following days, Xavier found excuses to return to Rose Street. He needed a hatband replaced. He wanted advice on a gift for his ranch foreman's daughter. He had heard Mrs. Foster could recommend a good seamstress for repairs to his jacket. Each time, Meredith saw through his pretenses, and each time she found herself allowing him into her shop anyway. There was something different about Xavier Abbott. He did not push or pry. He did not stand too close or let his gaze linger inappropriately. He simply talked to her as though she were a person, not a conquest or a mystery to be solved. He told her about his horses, about the ranch his father had built from nothing, about his sister Catherine and her twin daughters. He spoke about the changing West, the railroads bringing civilization and chaos in equal measure, the way the old trails were being fenced and settled. Meredith listened more than she spoke, but gradually she began to share small pieces of herself. She told him about learning millinery in Philadelphia, though she did not mention the circumstances that had brought her to that city or driven her away. She talked about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with her hands, the way a perfect hat could transform a woman's whole bearing. She even smiled occasionally, a real smile that lit her gray eyes and made Xavier's heart stagger in his chest. "You should smile more often," he said one afternoon, then immediately looked horrified at his own boldness. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." But Meredith did not seem offended. "I do not have much reason to smile, Mr. Abbott." "Xavier," he said. "Please call me Xavier." She hesitated, then nodded. "Xavier." His name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate, too dangerous, but she did not take it back. As June turned to July, the whole town began to notice Xavier Abbott's regular visits to the millinery shop. The gossips whispered that poor Mr. Foster must be dead or gone, and perhaps the horse trader had set his sights on the widow. Meredith heard the talk and felt the familiar walls closing in. She had been too careless, too relaxed. It was time to retreat again. When Xavier came to the shop the next Tuesday, she did not let him in. "Mrs. Foster," he knocked gently on the locked door. "Are you unwell?" "I am fine." Her voice came from behind the curtained window. "But I must ask you not to return, Mr. Abbott. People are talking, and it is not appropriate." Xavier felt as though he had been struck. "Have I offended you?" "If I have said or done anything, you have been a perfect gentleman," Meredith said, and there was real regret in her voice. "But that changes nothing. Please go." He wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but he had spent enough time with Meredith to recognize the fear beneath her words. So he simply said, "As you wish, madam," and walked away. But he did not leave Georgetown for a week. Meredith did not see Xavier, though she found herself looking for him despite her better judgment. The shop felt emptier now, the days longer. She told herself it was for the best, that she had been foolish to let him get even as close as he had. The scars on her back seemed to ache more than usual, a constant reminder of what happened when she trusted the wrong person. Then, on a Friday evening as she was closing the shop, a commotion erupted in the street outside. Meredith looked out to see a crowd gathering near the livery stable, and above the noise she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The scream of an injured horse. She did not think. She simply ran. The crowd parted as she pushed through, and there in the stable yard she saw Xavier kneeling beside a gray mare that had gotten tangled in barbed wire. The animal was thrashing in panic, blood streaming from deep gashes in her legs and chest, and Xavier was trying desperately to calm her while avoiding her flailing hooves. "Someone get a gun," the livery owner said grimly. "She is done for." "No," Xavier's voice was sharp. "Give me a chance to help her." But the horse was beyond reason, lost in pain and terror. One hoof caught Xavier across the shoulder, sending him sprawling. The livery owner raised his pistol. "Stop," Meredith heard her own voice ring out. She was moving forward before she could question the wisdom of it, dropping to her knees beside the mare's head. "Let me try." She did not know where the knowledge came from, some half-remembered piece of her childhood before everything went wrong, but her hands moved with certainty. She began to hum, low and steady, and her fingers found the mare's face, stroking in slow, rhythmic patterns. The horse's eye rolled toward her, white with fear, but Meredith did not flinch. "Easy, sweet girl," she murmured. "Easy now. No one is going to hurt you." Xavier watched in amazement as the mare's struggles gradually subsided. Meredith kept humming, kept stroking, and slowly the horse began to calm. When the mare finally lay still, breathing hard but no longer fighting, Meredith looked up at Xavier. "The wire," she said quietly. "Can you cut her free?" Together they worked to remove the barbed wire, Xavier's hands moving with the same gentleness Meredith had shown. The livery owner brought clean water and cloth, and they cleaned the wounds as best they could, while Meredith kept the mare calm with her voice and hands. It took nearly an hour, and by the time they finished, both Xavier and Meredith were covered in blood and dirt. The mare was standing now, trembling but alive, and the crowd had dispersed with disappointed murmurs. Apparently they had hoped for more drama. "That was remarkable," Xavier said, looking at Meredith with open admiration. "How did you know what to do?" Meredith stood, suddenly aware that she was alone with him in the shadowed stable. "My grandfather raised horses. I used to help him before." She trailed off, horrified at how close she had come to revealing too much. Xavier saw the shutters coming down again and acted on instinct. "Meredith," he said, using her given name for the first time. "Please do not run away again." She froze. "You do not understand." Then help me understand. He took a careful step toward her. I know you are afraid of something. I know you have secrets. But I also know that you are the kindest, strongest, most fascinating woman I have ever met, and I cannot stop thinking about you. Xavier. Her voice broke on his name. You do not have to tell me everything, he continued. You do not have to tell me anything, but please just let me know you. Let me be your friend, if nothing else. Meredith felt tears burning in her eyes, a weakness she could not afford. I cannot. Why not? The question hung in the air between them. Meredith could have walked away. She should have walked away. But standing there in the gathering dusk, smelling of horse blood and fear, she found herself suddenly, desperately tired of running. Because you are the first man in 5 years who has looked at me like I am a person worth knowing, she whispered. And I am terrified of what that means. Xavier's expression softened. Meredith, you are worth knowing. Whatever you think, whatever has happened to you, that truth does not change. She shook her head, backing toward the stable door. You do not know what you are saying. Then tell me. He did not follow her, did not try to close the distance between them. Tell me why you are so afraid. For a long moment, Meredith stood on the edge of confession. But the scars on her back burned like fresh wounds, and she could not find the words. I cannot, she said again, and fled into the night. Xavier did not chase her. He simply stood in the stable, watching her disappear into the shadows, and wondered what kind of monster had made such a remarkable woman believe she was not worth the effort of loving. The next day was Saturday, and Meredith did not open the shop. She sat in her small rooms above the store and stared at her hands, still faintly stained with the mare's blood. She had been so careful for so long, and in one moment of impulse, she had thrown all her caution away. The way Xavier had said her name, the look in his eyes, it was too much, too dangerous, too close to the treacherous warmth she had sworn never to feel again. She got up and began to pack. It was a familiar ritual. Sort through her possessions, keep only what she could carry, prepare to vanish before the questions started. She had done it in Philadelphia, in St. Louis, in a dozen smaller towns between there and Georgetown. She had become an expert at disappearing. But as she folded her dresses and wrapped her few precious belongings, Meredith found her hands slowing, then stopping. She looked around the little room that had been her home for 3 years, the longest she had stayed anywhere since running. She thought of her shop, her customers, the life she had built here in the shadow of the mountains. She thought of Xavier's gentle hands on the injured mare, the way he had listened to her without judgment, the careful distance he maintained even when she could see the longing in his eyes. She thought of spending the rest of her life running, and something inside her finally broke. Meredith Foster unpacked her bags. On Sunday morning, she dressed in her simplest calico dress and walked to the small white church at the edge of town. She had never attended services before, and her appearance caused a ripple of surprise through the congregation. Meredith barely heard the sermon. She sat in the back pew with her hands clenched in her lap, trying to remember how to pray. When the service ended, she slipped out quickly, but not quickly enough to avoid Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife and Georgetown's most persistent matchmaker. Mrs. Foster, how wonderful to see you here. You must join us for Our Lady's Social on Tuesday. We meet at my house to do charity sewing, and we would be delighted to have your expertise. Meredith's first instinct was to refuse, but she heard herself say, Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, I will come. The older woman beamed. Excellent, 2 o'clock, and do bring any fabric scraps you can spare. We are making quilts for the orphanage in Denver. As Meredith walked back to her shop, she felt as though she were stepping off a cliff. She was making connections, putting down roots, doing all the things she had sworn were too dangerous, but she could not seem to stop herself. She did not see Xavier that day, or the next. She went to Mrs. Henderson's social on Tuesday and endured the curious questions and speculative looks with as much grace as she could muster. The ladies were kind, if nosy, and Meredith found herself almost enjoying the afternoon. It had been so long since she had simply sat with other women, sharing gossip and laughter over needlework. On Wednesday afternoon, Xavier finally appeared at her shop. He looked uncertain, as though expecting to be turned away again. "I came to check on your shoulder," Meredith said before he could speak. "The mare kicked you quite hard." Xavier blinked in surprise, then a slow smile spread across his face. "It is bruised but healing well. Thank you for asking." They stood looking at each other for a moment, and then Meredith stepped aside. "Would you like to come in? I have coffee if you would care for some." It was a small offering, but Xavier understood the significance. "I would like that very much." They sat in the back room of the shop, drinking coffee and talking about inconsequential things. Xavier told her the gray mare was recovering well, that he had decided to keep her rather than sell her because she had shown such fighting spirit. Meredith told him about the ladies' social, making him laugh with her gentle descriptions of Mrs. Henderson's matchmaking attempts. "Did she try to set you up with someone?" Xavier asked, then immediately wished he could take the question back, but Meredith just shook her head. "She believes I am a widow still in mourning, though I suspect my mourning period is running out in her estimation." "Are you a widow, I mean?" Meredith set down her coffee cup with careful precision. "No, I have never been married." Xavier waited, but she did not elaborate. "The Mrs. is for protection, then?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "I find that men are more likely to leave a woman alone if they believe she belongs to someone else." There was a wealth of pain in that statement, and Xavier felt anger rising in his chest at whoever had taught her such caution. "Meredith, did someone hurt you?" She flinched as though he had struck her. For a long moment she sat frozen, and Xavier cursed himself for pushing too hard, too fast. But then Meredith drew a shaking breath. "Yes," she whispered. "Someone hurt me very badly. And I have been running from it ever since." Xavier's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice gentle. "Do I need to be worried that this person will come looking for you? No, he is dead." Meredith's voice was flat. "I made sure of that before I left Philadelphia." The admission hung in the air between them. Xavier processed what she had said, understanding dawning slowly. "You killed him, in self-defense." Meredith stood abruptly, turning her back to him. "He was my employer. I worked in his household, and he took liberties. When I tried to leave, he became violent. There was a knife. We struggled. He fell and I ran." Her voice was shaking now. "I do not know if the authorities ever looked for me. I did not stay to find out. For all I know, there is a warrant for my murder, or perhaps his family covered it up to avoid the scandal. I simply ran, and I have been running ever since." Xavier stood slowly, his mind racing. He wanted to go to her, to pull her into his arms and promise that everything would be all right, but he sensed that would be too much. "How long ago?" 5 years. I was 18. So young, Xavier thought, his heart breaking for her. "And you have been alone all this time." "It is safer that way." Meredith wrapped her arms around herself. "People ask fewer questions. There are fewer chances for someone to recognize me, to connect me to what happened." "Meredith, look at me." Xavier waited until she turned, her eyes bright with unshed tears. 5 years is a long time. If they were going to come for you, they would have done it by now. And even if they did, what happened was self-defense. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You do not understand." Her voice broke. "He did not just. It was not just that once. It went on for months. And I stayed because I needed the position, because I had nowhere else to go. I let it happen." "No," Xavier's voice was sharp. "You survived. That is not the same as letting it happen." Meredith shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "You cannot possibly want anything to do with me now." Xavier took a careful step toward her, moving slowly as he would with a frightened horse. "Meredith Foster, I have spent the last 3 weeks trying to figure out how to make you smile. Do you honestly think learning that you survived something terrible is going to change how I feel about you?" She stared at him, disbelieving. "How can it not? Because you are still the same woman who calmed that mare with just your voice and your hands. You are still the woman who creates beautiful things and treats everyone with kindness. You are still the strongest person I have ever met." He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to reach but not crowding. "What happened to you does not define you, Meredith. How you survived it does." The tears were flowing freely now, and Meredith could not seem to stop them. "I have scars," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He beat me more than once. The last time he used a riding crop. My back is covered in scars, and they are hideous, and I have never let anyone see them because I cannot bear the thought of seeing disgust in someone's eyes when they look at me." Xavier felt as though his heart had been ripped from his chest. He understood now why she wore high collars even in summer, why she moved with such careful control, why she had built such high walls around herself. "Meredith," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "May I come closer?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Xavier closed the distance between them and slowly, carefully, as though approaching something infinitely precious and fragile, he reached out and took her hands. "I cannot see your scars," he said quietly, "and you do not have to show them to me until you are ready, if ever. But I promise you this, when you do, if you do, I will not see them as hideous. I will see them as proof that you survived, as evidence of your strength, as part of the woman I am falling in love with." Meredith's breath caught. "Xavier, you cannot—" "I can," he interrupted gently. "I am. I probably have been since the first moment I saw you through that window. But I understand that you need time. I understand that trust does not come easily for you. So I am not asking for anything right now except the chance to keep knowing you, to be your friend, and maybe, someday, to be more." She looked at their joined hands, at the way his calloused fingers held hers with such gentleness. "I do not know how to do this," she admitted. "I do not know how to let someone in. Then we will figure it out together." Xavier smiled, and it was the warmest, most genuine expression she had ever seen. No pressure, no expectations, just two people getting to know each other. "Can you give me that much?" Meredith thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the ways this could end badly. But she also thought about 3 weeks of Xavier's quiet kindness, about the way he had never pushed or demanded, about the way her heart had lifted every time she heard his footsteps outside her shop. "Yes," she whispered, "I can give you that much." Xavier's smile widened, and he lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then that is all I ask." They stood like that for a long moment, and Meredith felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer filled every corner of her being. There was room now for something else, something fragile and new and terrifying in its own way. Hope. Over the following weeks, Georgetown watched with interest as Xavier Abbott and Miss Foster, as she had quietly started calling herself, dropping the pretense of widowhood, conducted a courtship, unlike any the town had seen. Xavier did not press for outings or demand her time. Instead, he simply made himself part of her daily life in the smallest, gentlest ways. He brought her coffee from the hotel dining room each morning, always leaving it on her doorstep with a wildflower from the mountain meadows. He fixed the squeaking hinge on her shop door without being asked. When a drunk miner got aggressive outside her window one evening, Xavier was there within minutes, calmly escorting the man away without violence. Meredith, in turn, found herself looking for ways to let him into her life. She began taking her lunch breaks when Xavier was in town, and they would sit on the bench outside her shop, sharing sandwiches and conversation. She showed him how to shape felt into a hat crown, laughing at his clumsy attempts. When he mentioned his ranch needed curtains for the new bunkhouse, she offered to make them, and spent happy hours selecting fabric and stitching seams while he sat nearby and read to her from the newspaper. They talked about everything and nothing. Xavier told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father's death 2 years prior, and the way he still sometimes turned to ask the old man a question before remembering he was gone. Meredith talked about her childhood in rural Ohio, about her mother's death when she was 12, and her father's remarriage to a woman who did not want another mouth to feed. She spoke carefully around the painful parts, but Xavier was learning to read the silences between her words. "Is that why you went to Philadelphia? After your stepmother, she sent me into service when I was 16, said it was time I earned my keep." Meredith's voice was matter-of-fact, but Xavier heard the hurt beneath. The first household was decent enough, but they fell on hard times and had to let me go. The second place, that was where I met him. Xavier's jaw tightened, but he simply nodded. He was learning that Meredith would share her story at her own pace, and pushing would only make her retreat. As summer deepened, and the aspens on the mountainsides turned from green to gold, something else began to grow between them. It showed in the way Meredith's face lit up when she saw Xavier coming down the street. It was there in the way Xavier's hand would hover near the small of her back when they walked together, protective but never possessive, always giving her space to move away if she chose. It was there in the stolen glances, the accidental touches that lingered a moment too long, the conversations that stretched late into the evening until the stars came out above Georgetown's mountain-ringed horizon. One evening in early September, they sat on the bench outside Meredith's shop, watching the last light fade from the sky. The air had the crisp edge of coming autumn, and Meredith had allowed herself to sit close enough that their shoulders touched. "I have to go back to the ranch for a few weeks," Xavier said quietly. "There is work that cannot wait any longer." Meredith felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Of course, you have responsibilities. Come with me." She turned to look at him, startled. "What?" Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Come with me to the ranch. I know it is a big step, and I understand if you are not ready, but I want you to see my home, Meredith. I want to show you the life I am building there. And selfishly, I do not want to be away from you for weeks." Meredith's heart was racing. The thought of leaving Georgetown, even temporarily, terrified her, but the thought of weeks without Xavier's steady presence terrified her more. "I would need to close the shop," she said slowly. "And I have never left town since I arrived here." "I know." Xavier squeezed her hand. "Think about it. You do not have to decide tonight." But Meredith had spent 3 months learning to trust this man, learning to believe that not everyone wanted to hurt her. "Yes," she said before she could talk herself out of it. "I will come with you." Xavier's face broke into a smile that made him look years younger. "Truly, truly." Meredith smiled back, feeling reckless and terrified and more alive than she had in 5 years. "But Xavier, I need to tell you something first." His expression sobered. "All right." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "If I am going to your home, if I am going to trust you that much, then I need you to understand exactly what you are getting into. I need to show you," her voice faltered and she had to start again. "I need to show you my scars." Xavier went very still. "Meredith, you do not have to do that, not for me. I know." And she did know, which was why she could finally do this. "But I want to. I want you to see all of me, not just the parts I have learned to keep hidden. I want. She struggled to find the words. I want to stop hiding from you. Xavier lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. Then I will be honored to see whatever you choose to show me. But not here, not now. This is not something that should be rushed. Meredith nodded, relieved and disappointed at the same time. Tomorrow, then. Come to my rooms after the shop closes. I will be there, Xavier promised. And Meredith. Whatever I see tomorrow, it will not change how I feel about you. You need to believe that. I am trying, she whispered. I am really trying. That night, Meredith barely slept. She lay in her narrow bed and felt the scars on her back burning as they had not in years. She thought about the look on Xavier's face when he saw them, tried to prepare herself for the possibility that his kindness would finally have limits. But she had made the decision, and Meredith Foster did not back down once her course was set. The next day passed in a blur. Meredith went through the motions of work, helping customers and pinning hems, but her mind was elsewhere. When she finally turned the shop sign to closed and locked the door, her hands were shaking. Xavier arrived exactly on time, his hat in his hands and an expression of gentle concern on his face. Are you all right? No, Meredith said honestly, but I am going to do this anyway. She led him up the narrow stairs to her rooms above the shop. It was the first time he had been in her private space, and Xavier looked around with interest at the simple but comfortable furnishings, the shelf of books, the sewing machine in the corner. Sit, Meredith said, gesturing to the chair by the window. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Please. Xavier sat, never taking his eyes off her. Meredith stood in the center of the room, her back to him, and realized she had no idea how to begin. I have been wearing armor for 5 years, she said quietly. Not real armor, but layers, emotional walls, physical distance. High collars and long sleeves. I built a life where no one could touch me, where no one could get close enough to hurt me again. She paused, her hands moving to the buttons at her throat. You are the first person who has made me want to take that armor off. Meredith, please, she interrupted. Let me do this before I lose my courage. Xavier fell silent, and Meredith began to unbutton her dress with trembling fingers. She wore a chemise underneath, and she slipped the dress off her shoulders and let it fall to her waist. Then, with a deep breath, she turned to face him. The chemise was modest, high-necked and long-sleeved, but Xavier could see the way she held herself, the tension in every line of her body. She looked like a woman preparing for execution. I am going to turn around, Meredith said, and I am going to lower the back of my chemise. You can look, or you can close your eyes, but I need to do this. I need to stop being ashamed of what was done to me. I am not going to close my eyes, Xavier said quietly, and I want you to know right now that nothing I see is going to change how I feel about you. Meredith nodded, not quite believing him but grateful for the words anyway. She turned, presenting her back to him, and with shaking hands she unfastened the top buttons of her chemise and let it slide down to her waist. The scars were exactly as she had described them. A crosshatch of raised white lines across her back and shoulders, some thin as thread, others thick as rope. They told a story of violence and pain, of someone who had been beaten repeatedly with a flexible weapon designed to cut and mark. Xavier felt rage rise in him like a physical force, rage at the monster who had done this to her, rage at the world that had allowed it to happen. But he pushed the anger down, knowing it was not what Meredith needed right now. Instead, he stood slowly and crossed the room to her. May I touch you? Meredith's voice was barely a whisper. Yes. Xavier reached out with one hand and gently, so gently, traced his fingers across the worst of the scars, a thick ridge that ran from her left shoulder blade down to her lower back. Meredith flinched at the first touch, then forced herself to hold still. "Does it hurt?" Xavier asked. "Not physically. Not anymore." He traced another scar and another, mapping the damage with reverent fingers. "These are terrible," he said quietly. "Not because they make you any less beautiful, but because of what they represent. Because someone hurt you this badly and made you believe you deserved it." Meredith felt tears starting to fall. "I stayed. After the first time, after the second, I stayed. That makes me complicit." "No." Xavier's voice was firm. "It makes you human. It makes you someone who needed the job, who was afraid to leave, who probably tried a dozen times to make it better before you finally had no choice but to fight back. Do not let him make you the villain in this story, Meredith. You are the survivor." His hand settled on her shoulders, warm and solid and completely unlike any touch she had experienced before. There was nothing sexual in it, nothing possessive. It was simply a man offering comfort to a woman who had been denied it for far too long. "You told me I would not be disgusted," Xavier continued. "And I am not. I am heartbroken for you. I am furious at him. But when I look at you, all I see is strength. All I see is a woman who survived hell and came out the other side with enough courage to build a new life. All I see is someone I am falling more in love with every single day." Meredith turned in his arms, not caring that her chemise fell further, that she was more exposed than she had been with any person since that terrible night. Xavier's eyes stayed on her face, never dropping lower, giving her the respect her attacker had never shown. "I am so afraid," she whispered. "I am afraid of trusting you, afraid of what happens if I let myself love you and you turn out to be like him. I know." Xavier cupped her face in his hands. "And I cannot give you any guarantees. All I can do is promise that I will never, ever hurt you intentionally, that I will be patient, that I will go at your pace, whatever that pace might be. And that if you decide tomorrow or next week or next year that you cannot do this, I will respect that choice." Meredith looked into his hazel eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. "What if I am broken? What if I can never be the kind of woman you deserve?" "Then we will be broken together," Xavier said simply. "Because I have my own scars, Meredith. They just happen to be on the inside. Everyone is damaged in some way. That does not make us unworthy of love. It just makes us human." She kissed him then, rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of salt and tears and desperate hope. Xavier kissed her back with infinite gentleness, his hands never moving from her face, giving her complete control over how far this went. When they finally pulled apart, Meredith was crying in earnest, but for the first time in 5 years they were not tears of shame or fear. They were tears of relief, of release, of a burden finally shared. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." Xavier pressed his forehead to hers. "Thank you for trusting me enough to show me." They stood like that for a long moment, and then Meredith stepped back and pulled her chemise back into place, suddenly self-conscious. Xavier turned away while she dressed, giving her privacy, and when she finally said, "All right," he turned back to find her sitting on the edge of her bed, looking drained but somehow lighter. "You still want me to come to the ranch?" she asked. Xavier sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. "More than ever, but only if you still want to come." Meredith thought about it, thought about the risk and the fear and the 1,000 ways it could go wrong. But she also thought about the way Xavier's hands had felt on her scars, reverent instead of repulsed. She thought about the way he had looked at her with love instead of disgust. "I want to come," she said. "I want to see your life. I want to try to build something new." "Then we leave Monday," Xavier said. "We will take it slow, and if you change your mind at any point, I will bring you straight back." Meredith nodded, then surprised them both by leaning against his shoulder. Xavier put his arm around her and they sat together in the gathering dusk, two damaged people finding comfort in each other's presence. "Xavier," Meredith said after a while. "Yes, I think I might be falling in love with you too." She felt his smile against her hair. "I think that might be the best thing anyone has ever said to me." They sat together until the stars came out, and for the first time in 5 years, Meredith Foster allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to be happy. The journey to Xavier's ranch took 2 days by wagon, following the road down from the mountains and out onto the plains east of Denver. Meredith had closed her shop with a note promising to return in 3 weeks, and the ladies of Georgetown had taken her departure as confirmation that a wedding was in the offing. Mrs. Henderson had been particularly gleeful. Meredith found that she did not mind the speculation as much as she had expected. Something had shifted inside her that night in her room when Xavier had seen her scars and had not turned away. She was still afraid, still carrying all the weight of her past, but she was no longer carrying it alone. They traveled during the cool morning hours and rested during the heat of the day, camping one night beneath a sky so vast and star-filled that Meredith felt tiny and infinite all at once. Xavier made camp with practiced efficiency, building a fire and heating beans and salt pork for their supper. "Tell me about the ranch," Meredith said as they ate. "What is it like?" Xavier's face softened with affection. "It is home. My father started with 40 acres and a dream, and by the time he died he had built it up to nearly 500 acres of good grazing land. We run about 300 head of cattle plus the horses. I have a foreman, Jack Pierce, who has been with us since the beginning. He and his wife Sarah live in one of the cabins. Sarah is going to love you. How can you be so sure? Because she has been after me to settle down for years. She will take one look at you and start planning the wedding." Xavier paused. "Not that I am assuming anything. I just mean," Meredith laughed, the sound surprising them both. "I know what you meant, and Xavier, I would like to meet Sarah. I would like to see your home and meet the people who matter to you. They are going to be your people too if you will let them." The thought should have terrified her, but instead Meredith felt a warm glow settling in her chest. "I would like that." That night, they slept on opposite sides of the fire, properly chaperoned by the vast emptiness of the prairie. But in the morning, Meredith woke to find that sometime in the night she had shifted closer, and Xavier's coat had been draped over her as an extra blanket. It was a small gesture, but it made her smile. They reached the ranch in the late afternoon of the second day. The main house was a sturdy structure of stone and timber, built to withstand the harsh Colorado winters. Beyond it, Meredith could see a barn, several corrals, and 2 smaller cabins. The whole property was framed by the dramatic sweep of the Front Range, mountains rising purple and gold in the distance. "It is beautiful," Meredith breathed. "Wait until you see it in spring when the wildflowers are blooming." Xavier helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady at her waist. "Come on, I will introduce you." Sarah Pierce turned out to be a stout, practical woman in her 40s with laugh lines around her eyes and flour on her apron. She took one look at Meredith, then at Xavier's protective hovering, and broke into a delighted smile. "Well, it is about time," she declared, pulling Meredith into a hug before the younger woman could protest. "I told Jack just last month that Xavier was going to come home with a wife one of these days, and here you are." "Sarah, we are not," Xavier started, but Sarah waved him off. "Not yet, maybe, but I have eyes. Now, Miss Foster, you come with me. You must be exhausted from the journey. I have a room all ready for you in the main house, and I will not hear any arguments about propriety. Xavier, you make yourself useful and unload the wagon." Meredith found herself swept into the house before she could respond. But as she glanced back at Xavier, she saw him grinning, and she could not help but smile in return. The room Sarah showed her to was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in a wedding ring quilt and windows that looked out over the corrals. This was going to be for Xavier's sister when she visited, but Catherine has her own place in Denver now, Sarah explained. You settle in, and I will have hot water sent up so you can wash. Supper is at 6. When the door closed behind Sarah, Meredith sat on the bed and looked around. She had been so focused on surviving, on running, on staying hidden, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be welcomed. The warmth of it was almost overwhelming. That evening they ate supper with Sarah and Jack around the big table in the ranch house kitchen. Jack was a weathered man with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor, and he clearly thought of Xavier as a son. The conversation flowed easily, touching on ranch business and local gossip and the upcoming cattle drive. We will be moving the herd to the stockyards in Denver next month, Jack explained to Meredith. It is our biggest sale of the year. Xavier's father always said that drive would make or break us, and he has been right every year. Will you go with them? Meredith asked Xavier. Usually, yes, but this year I am thinking of staying behind. The ranch does not run itself, and Jack could use the help here. Xavier did not say what they were both thinking, that he did not want to leave Meredith alone so soon. Over the following days, Meredith settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She helped Sarah with the cooking and the kitchen garden, learning to bake bread in the big cast iron stove and to preserve the last of the summer vegetables. She watched Xavier work with the horses, his patience and gentleness with the animals never wavering even when they tested him. And slowly, carefully, they continued to build their relationship. Xavier showed Meredith every corner of the ranch, from the spring-fed pond where the cattle drank to the high meadow where wildflowers would bloom come April. They rode together in the evenings, Meredith on a gentle sorrel mare named Penny and Xavier on his roan gelding. He taught her to rope a fence post, laughing when her throws went wild, and she taught him to appreciate the subtle artistry of a well-made quilt. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Xavier spoke about the pressure of maintaining his father's legacy, the fear that he was not good enough to keep the ranch running. Meredith talked about her mother's death and the way it had changed everything, about her father's weakness in the face of his new wife's cruelty. I used to think he was strong, she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. But when he let her send me away, I realized he was just a coward. He chose his own comfort over his daughter's safety. Xavier took her hand. That must have been a terrible betrayal. It was, but it also taught me to rely on myself. I never want to be that powerless again, never want to be so dependent on someone else that I cannot leave if I need to. That is fair, Xavier said quietly. But Meredith, you should know that love does not have to mean losing yourself. The right kind of love makes you stronger, not weaker. It is a partnership, not a prison. Meredith leaned her head on his shoulder. I am beginning to believe that. You make me believe it. As the days passed, Meredith found herself relaxing in ways she had not thought possible. The constant vigilance that had defined her life for 5 years began to ease. She laughed more, smiled more, let herself enjoy the simple pleasure of Xavier's company without constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. One afternoon, she was in the kitchen with Sarah, kneading dough for the evening's bread, when the older woman said, "You are good for him, you know." Meredith looked up, surprised. "Xavier, that boy has been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders since his father died. He never lets himself rest, never lets himself just be happy. But since you came here, I have seen him smile more than he has in 2 years." Sarah shaped her own dough into a loaf with practiced hands. "Whatever brought you two together, I am grateful for it." even though you do not really know anything about me?" Meredith asked carefully. Sarah met her eyes. "I know what I need to know. I know you make Xavier happy. I know you work hard and do not expect special treatment. And I know you have been hurt badly, though you hide it well. The rest is your business." Meredith felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Thank you, Sarah." "No thanks needed, child. Just promise me you will give that boy a chance. He is one of the good ones." "I know he is," Meredith said softly. "That is what makes it so terrifying." That night, Xavier asked Meredith to walk with him after supper. They strolled out past the barn toward the pasture where the horses grazed in the twilight. The air had the crisp edge of autumn, and Meredith pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Are you cold? We can go back." "No, I am fine." Meredith looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "I like it out here. It is so peaceful." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and then Xavier said, "Meredith, there is something I want to ask you, but I do not want to push too hard." "Will you tell me if I am going too far?" Her heart began to race. "All right." Xavier stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "These last few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards, but I feel like I know you better than I have known anyone, and I know myself well enough to be certain of my own heart." "Xavier, please, let me finish." He squeezed her hands gently. "I am not asking you to marry me, not yet. I know you need more time and I want you to be absolutely certain, but I am asking you to stay. Not just for 3 weeks, but for as long as you want. Move to the ranch. Make a life here. We can court properly, with chaperones and calling hours and all the respectability you could want. Or we can just continue as we are, 2 people getting to know each other without any pressure or expectations. But I cannot imagine going back to a life without you in it, and I needed you to know that." Meredith looked at their joined hands, at the hope and fear mingled in Xavier's expression, and felt something inside her finally, completely break free. The last of her walls crumbled, and in their place was something terrifying and wonderful: love. "I do not want to go back to Georgetown," she heard herself say. "I do not want to go back to the shop or the little room or the life I built around hiding. I want to stay here with you. I want to see what we could build together." Xavier's face lit up like sunrise. "Truly, truly." Meredith smiled, feeling tears on her cheeks. "I am still afraid, Xavier. I am still carrying scars that might never fully heal, but I trust you, and I love you, and I want to try." Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her close but carefully, always aware of the damage beneath her dress. Meredith buried her face in his shoulder and let herself cry, releasing years of fear and loneliness and pain. "I love you too," Xavier murmured into her hair. "I love you so much, Meredith Foster, and I promise I will spend every day proving that you made the right choice in trusting me." They stood like that as the stars came out, 2 people finding healing in each other's arms, and Meredith felt something she had not felt in 5 long years. She felt safe. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Meredith's life. She sent a letter to Georgetown, arranging to sell her shop and have her possessions sent to the ranch. Mrs. Henderson wrote back with a long letter full of congratulations and pointed questions about wedding dates, which made Meredith laugh. She settled into life on the ranch, finding her place among the rhythms of the work. She took over most of the sewing and mending, her skilled fingers making quick work of torn shirts and worn-out trousers. She helped Sarah with the cooking and preserving, putting up jars of applesauce and pickled vegetables for the winter ahead. And she continued to court Xavier, learning the shape of his heart with the same care he had shown in learning hers. They were careful with each other, both aware of the fragility of what they were building. Xavier never pushed for more than Meredith was ready to give. He kissed her good-night on the porch after their evening walks, his lips gentle on hers, and never asked for more. He held her when she woke from nightmares about Philadelphia, whispering reassurances until she calmed, and never made her feel weak for needing the comfort. And gradually, Meredith learned to accept his love without waiting for it to curdle into something ugly. One evening in late October, as they sat together on the porch swing, Meredith said, "I want to show you something." Xavier looked at her questioningly, and she stood, taking his hand and leading him into the house. They went up to her room, and Meredith closed the door behind them. "Meredith." She turned to face him, her heart pounding but her hands steady. "You have been so patient with me, so careful, and I love you for it. But Xavier, I need you to know that I trust you completely. I need to prove to myself that I am not broken beyond repair." Understanding dawned in Xavier's eyes. "You do not have to prove anything to me, I know, but I need to prove it to myself." Meredith began unbuttoning her dress, her movements slow and deliberate. "I need to know that I can be intimate with someone without being afraid, that I can be touched without flinching, and I need it to be you." Xavier's breath caught. "Meredith, are you certain? We do not have to rush this. I am certain." The dress fell away, leaving her in her chemise and petticoats. "I have been certain for weeks. I just needed to find the courage." Xavier crossed the room to her, moving slowly, giving her time to change her mind. When he reached her, he cupped her face in his hands. "Tell me what you need. I need you to be gentle. I need you to go slowly. And I need you to stop if I ask, no matter how far we have gone." "Always," Xavier promised. "Meredith, I will never do anything you do not want. You have my word." She kissed him then, pouring all her trust and love and hope into it. Xavier kissed her back with the same careful passion he had always shown, his hands moving to her waist but going no further. "You can touch me," Meredith whispered against his lips. "I want you to touch me." Xavier's hands trembled slightly as he began to unlace her corset, his eyes never leaving hers, watching for any sign of fear or hesitation. But Meredith felt none of her old panic, only a warm anticipation mixed with nervousness when her corset fell away and she stood before him in just her chemise. Xavier drew in a sharp breath. "You are so beautiful, even with the scars. Especially with the scars. They are part of you, Meredith, and I love every part of you." She turned, presenting her back to him, and slowly lowered the chemise. The scars were there as they always were, but this time she felt no shame. Xavier's hands traced them gently, reverently, and then his lips followed, pressing soft kisses to each raised line. Meredith gasped at the sensation, at the tenderness of it. "Xavier, let me love you," he murmured against her skin. "Let me show you how it should be." And she did. She let him undress her completely, let him lay her on the bed, let his hands and mouth explore her body with infinite gentleness. When fear threatened to overwhelm her, she told him, and he immediately stopped, holding her until the panic passed. When pleasure surprised her, making her gasp and arch into his touch, he smiled and showed her how much more there could be. Xavier undressed slowly, giving her time to adjust, to see his body in the lamplight. He was all lean muscle and sun-bronzed skin, and Meredith found herself fascinated by the differences between them, by the way he responded to her tentative touches with such obvious pleasure. "Are you certain?" he asked one final time, poised above her, his arms trembling with the effort of holding back. "I am certain," Meredith said, and pulled him down to her. It hurt a little at first, and Xavier was so careful, so slow, that Meredith wanted to weep at the kindness of it. He kissed away her tears and whispered words of love and reassurance, moving with exquisite gentleness until the pain faded and something else took its place. Wonder, joy, connection. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the lamplight, Meredith's head on Xavier's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt different somehow, as though a door that had been locked inside her had finally opened. "Are you all right?" Xavier asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I am better than all right." Meredith tilted her head to look at him. "I am happy, truly, completely happy." Xavier smiled and kissed her forehead. "Good. Because I plan to make you happy for the rest of your life if you will let me." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Abbott?" "Not yet. When I propose, it will be properly with a ring and everything." He paused. "But it is a promise. I promise to love you, to cherish you, to be patient with your fears and celebrate your strengths. I promise to build a life with you that feels safe and full and joyful. And I promise that I will never, ever hurt you the way you were hurt before." Meredith felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but they were good tears, happy tears. "I promise to trust you, even when it is hard. I promise to let you in, even when I am afraid. And I promise to love you with everything I have, for as long as I live." They sealed their promises with a kiss, and then Xavier pulled the quilt over them both. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found healing in love. The next morning, Sarah took one look at the way Meredith and Xavier smiled at each other over breakfast and declared that a wedding needed to be planned immediately. "Sarah, we are not," Xavier started, but Sarah cut him off. "Oh, please, you two are practically glowing. And besides, it is not proper for an unmarried woman to be living here without proper chaperonage, and I am getting too old to be up at all hours making sure proprieties are maintained." Meredith blushed crimson, but Xavier just laughed. "She has a point, you know." "Are you asking me to marry you so Sarah can get more sleep?" Meredith asked, raising an eyebrow. Xavier's expression turned serious. He got up from the table, walked around to where Meredith sat, and dropped to one knee. From his pocket, he pulled a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. "This was my mother's ring," he said quietly. "My father gave it to me before he died and told me to give it to the woman who made me understand what love really meant. Meredith Foster, you are that woman. You are brave and strong and kind, and you have taught me that love is not about possession or control, but about trust and respect and partnership. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here on this ranch, with these people who already love you? Will you let me spend the rest of my days proving that you made the right choice in trusting me?" Meredith looked at the ring, at Xavier's hopeful face, at Sarah beaming in the background. She thought about the girl she had been 5 years ago, broken and afraid and running. She thought about the woman she had become, scarred but surviving, hiding but never quite defeated, and she thought about the woman she could be now, loved and cherished and safe. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, Xavier Abbott, I will marry you." Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, much to Sarah's delighted laughter. They were married 6 weeks later, on a crisp December afternoon with snow falling softly on the mountains. The ceremony was held in the ranch house parlor, with Sarah and Jack as witnesses, and a circuit preacher officiating. Meredith wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple cream-colored wool with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers that Xavier had collected during their summer rides. Catherine and her family made the trip from Denver, and Meredith found an instant friend in Xavier's older sister. Catherine took one look at Meredith and pronounced her perfect for Xavier, then proceeded to tell embarrassing stories about his childhood that made everyone laugh. The ceremony itself was short and sweet. When the preacher asked if there was any reason the marriage should not proceed, there was only happy silence. And when Xavier slipped a second ring onto Meredith's finger, a wedding band, to match the engagement ring, his hands were steady and sure. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Xavier did, gently and thoroughly, and Meredith felt happiness bubble up inside her like champagne. When they finally pulled apart, she was crying again, but this time everyone understood they were tears of joy. The wedding supper was a feast Sarah had been planning for weeks. Roast beef and potatoes, fresh bread, apple pie made from the ranch's own orchard. There were toasts and laughter and stories, and Meredith found herself surrounded by warmth and acceptance in a way she had never experienced before. As the evening wound down and the guests retired to their rooms, Xavier took Meredith's hand and led her upstairs to the bedroom they would now share. He had spent the previous week making it perfect for her. A new quilt on the bed, curtains for the windows, a small writing desk in the corner where she could work on her sewing projects. "Welcome home, Mrs. Abbott," he said, closing the door behind them. Meredith looked around the room at the care Xavier had taken to make it theirs and felt her heart overflow. "I am home," she said wonderingly. "For the first time in my life I am actually home." Xavier pulled her into his arms. "And you always will be. This is your home, Meredith, our home. For as long as we both shall live." They made love that night with the confidence of people who knew and trusted each other completely. There was no fear, no hesitation, only joy and passion and the deep contentment of two people who had found their place in the world with each other. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters when the snow piled high and supplies ran low. There were droughts that tested the ranch's resources and economic downturns that made money tight. There were moments when Meredith's old fears resurfaced, when nightmares brought her gasping awake in the darkness, when unexpected sounds or movements made her flinch. But Xavier was always there, patient and steady, reminding her that she was safe, that she was loved, that the past could not hurt her anymore. And Meredith, in turn, brought light and laughter into Xavier's life, teaching him to slow down and appreciate the small moments, to trust that the ranch would survive even if he was not constantly working. Together, they built something beautiful. 2 years after their wedding, Meredith gave birth to a daughter with auburn hair and hazel eyes. They named her Grace, and she was the most perfect thing either of them had ever seen. Xavier cried when he held her for the first time, overwhelmed by the responsibility and the love. "She is going to grow up knowing she is cherished," he whispered to Meredith as she recovered from the birth. "She is going to grow up safe and loved and free to be exactly who she is meant to be." "She will," Meredith agreed, watching her husband cradle their daughter with infinite gentleness. "Because she has you for a father." Grace was followed by a son 2 years later, a sturdy boy they named Joshua after Xavier's father, and 3 years after that came another daughter, Emma, who had her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubborn determination. The ranch prospered under Xavier and Meredith's joint management. Xavier handled the cattle and horses, while Meredith took over the business side, her sharp mind for numbers ensuring they always turned a profit even in lean years. They expanded the property, adding another 100 acres and building a new barn. They hired more hands, and Meredith made sure everyone was treated fairly, remembering all too well what it was like to be at someone else's mercy. Sarah and Jack remained part of their lives, growing older but no less essential to the ranch's operation. Sarah taught Grace and Emma to bake and sew, while Jack showed Joshua how to rope and ride. They were the grandparents Meredith's children would have otherwise lacked, and the love was mutual. Catherine and her family visited often, and Meredith developed close friendships with several of the neighboring ranch wives. She never spoke about Philadelphia or the scars on her back, but she suspected that some of the women had their own secrets, their own reasons for understanding the need to leave the past behind. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier woke Meredith before dawn and led her out to the porch. The sun was just beginning to paint the mountains pink and gold, and the ranch was still wrapped in peaceful quiet. "You remember the first time I brought you here?" Xavier asked, pulling Meredith close to his side. "Of course. I was terrified. And now?" Meredith looked out at the land they had built together, thought of their 3 children sleeping upstairs, thought of the life they had created from the ashes of her past. "Now I am home." Xavier kissed her temple. "I love you, Meredith Abbott. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for building this life with me." "I love you too," Meredith said, turning in his arms to kiss him properly. "Thank you for being careful with me. Thank you for seeing all of me and loving me anyway." They stood together and watched the sun rise over their ranch. 2 people who had found healing in love, who had taken their scars and their fears and built something beautiful from them. Meredith Foster Abbott had spent 5 years running from her past, convinced that she was too damaged, too broken to ever deserve happiness. But Xavier Abbott had shown her a different truth, that healing was possible, that love could be gentle instead of violent, that the scars on her back did not define her worth. She was no longer running. She was home. And as their children grew and the ranch thrived, as the years turned the mountains from green to gold and back again, Meredith never forgot the gift Xavier had given her. He had been the first person she let see all of her scars and fears and broken pieces included. She had been terrified. And he had been very, very careful. Years later, when Grace was preparing to leave for boarding school in Denver, she found her mother in the sewing room, working on a quilt. "Mama, can I ask you something?" Meredith looked up and smiled. At 43, she had threads of silver in her auburn hair and lines around her eyes from years of laughter, but she was still beautiful. "Of course, sweetheart." Grace sat down, picking at the fabric scraps on the table. "How did you know Papa was the right one? How did you know you could trust him?" Meredith set down her needle and really looked at her daughter. Grace was 17 now, on the cusp of womanhood, and there had been a boy at the last church social who had made her blush. "That is a complicated question," Meredith said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "There is a boy, Thomas Henderson. He is nice and he makes me laugh, but I do not know if I can trust him. How do I know he is not just pretending?" Meredith felt her heart clench. She had always known this day would come, had always known she would need to find a way to teach her daughters about love and trust without burdening them with her own painful history. "Come here," she said, and Grace came to sit beside her. "I am going to tell you something I have never told you before, but you have to promise to keep it between us for now. Your brother and sister are too young." Grace's eyes widened. "I promise." So Meredith told her daughter an abbreviated version of her story. She did not go into graphic detail, but she was honest about being hurt, about running, about the scars she still carried. Grace listened with tears streaming down her face, and when Meredith finished, she threw her arms around her mother. "Mama, I am so sorry. I did not know." "I know, sweetheart. I never wanted you to carry that burden." Meredith held her daughter close. "But I am telling you now because I want you to understand that trust is not about certainty. I was never certain about your father, not completely. I was terrified. But he was patient and he was kind, and most importantly, he was careful with me. He showed me, through his actions more than his words, that I could trust him. How? He listened when I said no. He gave me space when I needed it. He never pushed me to share more than I was ready to share. And when I finally did show him my scars, he saw them as proof of my strength, not as marks of shame. Meredith pulled back to look at her daughter. That is how you know, Grace. You know someone is trustworthy not by what they say, but by what they do when you are vulnerable. Grace nodded slowly. Thomas is always very respectful. He has never tried to hold my hand without asking, and when I said I was not ready to be courted properly, he said he would wait. Then he sounds like a good boy. But Grace, there is no rush. You are young and you have your whole life ahead of you. Do not let anyone make you feel like you have to make decisions before you are ready. I know, Mama. Grace hugged her mother again. Thank you for telling me, and thank you for being so brave. I am not brave, sweetheart. I am just a survivor who got very, very lucky. That evening, Meredith told Xavier about the conversation. They were sitting on the porch as they often did, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. She is growing up, Xavier said, his voice tinged with sadness. She is. They all are. Meredith leaned her head on his shoulder. I worry about them, Xavier. I worry that the world will hurt them the way it hurt me. I know. But we have given them tools we did not have. Love, support, the knowledge that they are valued. That counts for something. I hope so. Xavier turned to kiss her temple. You were very brave telling Grace about your past. She needed to know, and maybe. Meredith paused, gathering her thoughts. Maybe it is time to stop hiding that part of myself, not to shout it from the rooftops, but to stop being ashamed. What happened to me was terrible, but I survived it. I built a good life. I raised 3 beautiful children. That is something to be proud of, not ashamed of. I have always been proud of you, Xavier said quietly, from the very first day. They sat together until the stars came out. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a love that weathered every storm. And when they finally went inside, Xavier helped Meredith unlace her corset as he had done thousands of times before, his fingers gentle on the scars he knew by heart. I love you, he whispered, pressing a kiss to the worst of the marks, the thick ridge that ran from shoulder to lower back. I love you too, Meredith replied, turning in his arms. Thank you for being careful with me. Always, Xavier promised, for as long as we both shall live. And he kept that promise, through all the years that followed, through the joys and the sorrows, through the times of plenty and the times of want. He was careful with her heart, gentle with her fears, patient with her healing. Meredith Foster Abbott had been broken once, but she had not stayed broken. She had found a man who saw her scars and loved her anyway, who gave her the time and space to learn to trust again, who built a life with her that was everything she had never dared to dream of. She was the woman who had let him see all of her, scars and fears and broken pieces included. She had been terrified, and Xavier Abbott had been very, very careful. They lived long, happy lives together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, building a legacy of love that extended far beyond the boundaries of their ranch. And when they were old and gray, sitting together on that same porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Meredith would still sometimes marvel at how different her life had turned out from what she had expected. "What are you thinking?" Xavier would ask, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Meredith would reply. "About how you saved me." "No," Xavier would always correct her, squeezing her hand. "You saved yourself, my love. I just gave you a safe place to land." And that, Meredith thought, was the truest thing of all. She had saved herself, had found the courage to trust again, had built a life worth living from the ruins of her past. But Xavier had given her the space to do it, had been careful with her healing heart, had loved her through the fear and the pain and out the other side. Together, they had created something beautiful. Together, they had come home. The end.